Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event exploring digital IDs and government service delivery. The ability to identify oneself is something many of us take for granted, but it's fundamental to how we participate in important social activities and services. By some measures, close to 1 billion people around the world and over 20 million Americans do not have access to any form of identification. Without a valid form of ID, individuals face barriers to property ownership, healthcare, voting, and crucially, accessing government services. Whether an individual is applying for state health insurance, a federal student loan, or veterans benefits, government agencies must verify whether that person is who they say they are. Identity verification and authentication grows even more complicated as governments expand their digital service offerings and require a secure and reliable way for people to improve their identity online. Digital IDs and online identity solutions seem to offer a way to overcome this challenge, but still raise a number of questions, such as how do federal agencies vet digital identity solutions that are best for their customers? What barriers to implementation are agencies facing right now? What are the privacy and security concerns around digital ID programs and how can these be mitigated? And also, how can we learn from examples of these programs from around the world? My name is Eric Egan. I'm the Policy Fellow for Digital Government at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on the intersection of technology, public policy, and innovation. Today, I'm excited to be joined by an excellent group of people to discuss these questions. Jordan Burris is Vice President of Public Sector Strategy at Socure. Elizabeth Bynum-Sorrell is Policy Researcher at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. David Eves is Associate Professor for Digital Government at University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Finally, Jeremy Grant is Managing Director of Technology Business Strategy at Venable LLP. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here. And for the audience members joining us today, this program is meant to be interactive, and the panel welcomes your questions and comments. You're invited to submit these via Slido. If you're watching from ITIF's website, you can view the link for Slido at the bottom of that page. And if you follow issues like these, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications to hear about more events and to see all of our past events. Okay, that's all the housekeeping. So I think one good place to start maybe is to kind of clarify what we mean by digital identity and digital IDs. And I was thinking maybe each of you can kind of go around the digital room here and kind of share your own maybe definition and interpretation, particularly as it pertains to your respective background and kind of the work you do in this space. So maybe we can start alphabetically, Jordan, with you in terms of last name.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for having me on today's discussion. And so for me, the way that I try to frame it is that digital identity represents the opportunity or the ability for someone to convey who they are in an online realm, right? It's kind of taking the next step, but beyond what we see today with what would be someone's legal or physical identity and being able to say, okay, now that I'm engaging in cyberspace, how do I, how am I able to convey that to an audience? And this is made up and comprised of a series of characteristics or elements associated with someone. Could be something as simple as the type of device I'm using, my PII as basis, or even my face, right? And so all of those characteristics taken and looking at holistically are what able to make up someone's digital identity.
Yeah, I think I'm next alphabetically. So my work at the Beck Center on the Digital Benefits Network is very focused on what does it look like? What does digital identity look like in public benefits applications online? So when I think about digital identity, I'm thinking not necessarily always about credentials that someone is presenting digitally, but what are the steps that someone is asked to take online when they are being asked to demonstrate who they are as part of a process for securing access to public benefits. And that we'll talk more about this, I think, during our conversation, what that looks like, but thinking about how that's an opportunity or how that can sometimes be an obstacle for beneficiaries and applicants. And kind of something that I'm excited to talk about today is what are the ways that we can improve those processes, both for users and from the agency perspective.
It's rare and exciting to have the last name of starting with E in third. When I think of digital IDs, I'm looking more internationally at kind of what's going on in other countries around the world. And here, I think it takes, I agree with both Jordan and Elizabeth. I think they're going kind of a step further. And so I think of kind of like, first, when we talk about IDs, the first thing you want to kind of is like, there's a lot of identifications that one can have in real life, and those can be public or private. But I think what I'm particularly interested in is like, what is the foundational ID? what is the thing that really causes people to say, yes, David Eves is David Eves because the state or some authority that everybody sees as being credible has decided and has declared that I am who I claim to be. And so the foundational idea is like, I think one thing to kind of often, is one thing just for listeners to kind of be aware of. And so often your foundational idea is your birth certificate. That is the thing that people can point to and hold that says, like, I exist in the eyes of the state, and I am who I claim I am because of this certificate. And I think for the last several hundred years, that has existed as a piece of paper because interactions with the world have been kind of in an analog form. But the digital and the analog world are now fusing. And so there's almost nothing that you do where you wouldn't want it, like in some capacity, to do it online, because doing it online is not online. It's like you're in the store and you want to buy something. You're not giving cash. That transaction is digital, even though you're physically present. And same, if you go to a government office, a lot of the time now, like, you want to be able to engage in a transaction that is both digital and analog at the same time. So how can you present that credential? So when I think we talk about IDs, what I'm particularly interested in is, what does it look like to be able to create foundational IDs that can serve public and private needs and can be built on top of, that are digitally provisioned to allow for this flexibility and allow for inclusion, but be done so in ways that enable safety and security.
Thanks. And I'm also, as a G, not used to being the last in the group, but here's the new experiences. So I tend to often break down digital identity into two different components, and it's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's helpful for just to sort of set the stage. There's identity proofing, which is essentially the process you go through the first time you're trying to apply for an account, set up an account, trying to figure out, is there really a Jeremy Grant that's out there? Which of the 300 Jeremy Grants in the US is this? What I would call identity resolution. And then finally, is it actually really this particular person or somebody who might be trying to spoof that person online? And then there's authentication, which is essentially what you do to log back in after an account's already been established. That's essentially the password problem, or these days it's password plus MFA. One thing I've been saying for several years now is that authentication is getting easier, in part because of things like the FIDO standards, which are emerging. Globally, you have countries and companies and governments working together on new standards to basically bake the ability to do, passwordless logins that are very strong, basically unphishable, into the devices that we're all transacting on. But while authentication is starting to get easier, identity proofing is getting harder, in that identity proofing, at the end of the day, the government in pretty much every country is the only nationally recognized authoritative issuer of identity. But there's a gap both in the US as well as in a lot of other countries around the globe between those nationally recognized physical credentials that work in the offline world and the inability to have any counterpart to those online. And what we have been seeing is that certainly in the US, but also globally, criminals, hostile nation states have been exploiting that gap between physical and digital to steal lots of money and data and do lots of harm. One final thing I'll say, we'll talk about it a little bit today. I mentioned authentication is getting easier. Another thing with identity proofing is ideally we're getting to a place where I go through it once someplace and it's reusable, as opposed to having to prove who I am again and again and again, because it can be a burdensome process. But we'll probably dive into what that could look like a little later.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for sharing it. As expected, you're bringing different perspectives and thinking about this in different ways, which is good, for sure. And I'm glad it's a good mix. So, I mean, David, you were talking a little bit about as I was a recent student of yours, so I'm very aware of your knowledge and around kind of these different international programs. And I was thinking one thing we could do here is, most of our audience will be kind of in the federal space, but in the US. But I would love for you to be able to share, some of, without going too far into the weeds, some of those programs, kind of particularly in terms of, how they could be useful for American consideration. Some of them, as we talked about in your class, you can point to the well-known ones, and oftentimes in the federal space, they'll say like, well, that's, we're not Estonia, we can't implement that here. We're not India, we can't implement that here. But like, what else have you seen kind of internationally that you think is valuable for kind of an American audience?
So I think one thing that's worth noting is, so governments are always kind of slow, and I don't say that in like a negative way, but like they should be slow and cautious. Like I don't actually like my governments using cutting edge technology. I want them to be fast followers, not early adopters. And so I think, maybe we're at this point now where it's like, it is very clear now that operating in the physical world often means you have to also equally be able to operate in a digital world. So if you like banking in the 21st century is not going to be all analog systems and cash, in hand, and paper IDs that use, like, it is going to be deeply connected with digital. Therefore, if you care about access and inclusion as a government, and you want to make sure that everybody has access to the banking system, everybody has access to being able to do transactions, then you need to think about, like, where does ID fit as part of the kind of the infrastructure that we provision to society? And I think what's been really interesting internationally is that responsibility is now by many players is being seen as a state responsibility. So in the United States, and I would actually say the overwhelmingly large part, like the OECD world in general, this is kind of seen as kind of like a private sector problem. Like, we will get you a birth certificate, then everything that gets strapped on top of that birth certificate is kind of basic privately sector provisioned. But actually the flow of the world outside the United States is actually the opposite of that, which is to say, no, the state has a role in provisioning some form of digital ID that you can use, like in Elizabeth's case, that she cares about, like accessing government services, but also, for doing KYC, it's going to be more Jeremy cares about, like for doing KYC in order to access banking services. And that this is kind of like the new birth certificate. And so now you're kind of thinking about, like, what is the society level infrastructure, like an infrastructure view on identity that's provisioned by the government. It's a very different model. It has new threats that I don't want to shy away and pretend don't exist, but also huge advantages that I don't think we should shy away and pretending from existing. And so that's what I think you're seeing happening in a number of countries around the world.
Yeah, I just wanted to flag, I love the way David's talking about identity as infrastructure. It's something we've been talking about quite a bit. In addition to my role at Venable, I run an organization called the Better Identity Coalition, which is a couple dozen companies, both big buyers of digital identity as well as many of the vendors, collaborating on the policy layer of identity, really looking at what does the government need to do next. We talk a lot about the idea of identity as critical infrastructure, something CISA's talked about within DHS in the past, their 2019 National Critical Functions. Flagged identity services as one of 55 different critical functions, but it's probably the one area of all of that list of those 55 different things where we don't actually have any sort of national focus, national strategy for how to actually create that infrastructure and harden it. So work is definitely needed there.
Yeah, and if just to chime on real quick and add on, I mean, I think what Jeremy and David are saying is key, and the important piece to note is that, I mean, ultimately it's broken, right? Like our identity infrastructure as it looks within the US today is broken. It's fragmented. It does not work for everyone. And with that, there's opportunity for us to improve it. Now, there's a number of great strides that are being made across the board, but if we're to be realistic about what this means in concert of serving everyone, in particular, like there definitely must be more of a holistic approach.
I'd just like to really plus 1 second what's been said by David, Jordan, and Jeremy so far. Our team at the Beck Center recently put out a guide on activities related to digital identity at the federal level, partly because we had noticed, like, there's a lot happening across agencies in Congress, but these things aren't necessarily being talked about together as part of a broader context or picture. And they're certainly not being advanced as part of a singular strategy around digital identity. And I do think that this infrastructure framing is quite important.
Yeah, I'm glad y'all are already being able to see the connections. David, I saw you shared one of your recent op-eds on digital public infrastructure, and that was also another part of your course. And Jeremy, likewise, it's something you've focused on. I think in one of your op-eds, you even called digital ID kind of the great enabler. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is that there's a transformative kind of infrastructural impact that it can have. But I'm wondering, this actually may hit on one of our audience questions a little bit, is, is that kind of transformation, or is that kind of infrastructure, does that require something like a national ID? So one of our questions was, an EID, electronic ID, requires that every person is identifiable, like a unique identifier, or a personal identification code. So like there's many kind of pseudo versions, de facto versions of that in the US, Social Security number being probably the closest we have. But, does that level of infrastructure require a national ID, which is to many kind of a scary and wary conversation, or can it happen kind of without that? And this may be a bit of a technical question as well, but I'll kind of open that up to the group.
So yeah, if don't mind me jumping in, the answer is no, we don't need a national ID. But I think we have been hamstrung on this issue for years in the US, because every time somebody talks about digital identity, within about 30 seconds, the conversation immediately goes to, oh, why don't we do a national ID? Have you seen what the Estonians have done? It's awesome. And then everybody goes, God, and they run back and they throw stuff at it because you're touching this third rail, and the conversation stops, which I've always found frustrating, because, we do not need a national ID. What we need is nationally recognized digital identity solutions. And that can actually be a very different thing. Within the Better Identity Coalition, I think we've helped to change the debate in a helpful way, because in the policy blueprint we put out in 2018, I should throw a link to it in the chat, but in the meantime, I can at least hold it up and wave it around. We made this point, which is we don't need a national ID card. In fact, our problem is we have too many ID cards. We have a whole bunch of different authoritative systems issued by federal, state, and local levels, and they're all stuck in the paper world. So rather than build new systems, which is where I think you start to get a lot of the big concerns when it comes to security and privacy and civil liberties, why don't we just focus on creating digital counterparts to those physical systems that we have today? No new systems, just new form factors, new ways to carry them, present them, use them online. And from our perspective, that's really helped to change the discussion in the US, because it kind of disarmed everybody who gets very worked up about the idea of these new systems, when we pointed out there's actually a better way that just leverages the systems we have today. So I tend to think, it's great to study Estonia. It's great to study what India has done with Aadhaar, which is big central match biometrics, at scale. But we need a distinctly American approach in the US. And, let's focus on leveraging the systems we have today, rather than trying to create something brand new that in many cases would duplicate what we already have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the notion of finding different ways that we can approach this and treating it more as a national approach or a national strategy for digital identity, right? We also tend to have this, and even back in time when I used to serve in government, we have this tendency to all run towards one solution, thinking that is the end all be all and that's going to solve all our problems. You mentioned Social Security number, which was never actually intended to be what it's being used for today. If we look at the credit ecosystem, that's actually become a gatekeeper / proxy for someone's digital identity and the way that it is treated. And even if we talk about the different types of mobile driver's licenses and things along those lines, we still haven't fundamentally fixed some of the flaws that exist with, Real ID, or the fact that not everyone has some of these foundational documents put in place in order to establish their identity in the first place, right? One anecdote I throw out, because my daughter isn't old enough to smack me yet, is that when she was born at the hospital, due to a clerical error, she wasn't issued a Social Security card. Now, I, working in this space, knew the importance of her having said card and how it was going to impact her down the road, but not everyone knows that, right? And for me to go get this card, I had to go in the middle of the workday, hot Virginia summer, stand in line for 3 hours in order to do it. Anyone else likely would have left, especially if they didn't have the ability to just take and dedicate this time to do it, right? And so, we haven't fixed some of the basic things that are needed in order to do it. So I think national strategy, national approach is absolutely essential, but we also need to be accounting for the areas where, frankly, our system is letting people down and has historically been letting them down.
Yeah, that's. I think we're already hitting on so many areas I want to go into. Some are kind of the barriers to implementation in the US, and others are kind of access issues, right? So it's even if you're kind of digitizing existing ID forms, there are still barriers to those access, as you were saying, Jordan, right? It could be a clerical error for not getting a social security number. It could be the birth certificates are notoriously difficult to get a hang of it. So if you don't have that, you can't really get a social security number. And it's the same with, I think the one version that we're seeing most of in the US are mobile driver's license, right? In terms of digital IDs. It's still very patchwork, right? And people are doing it very differently. It's at the state level, but that is itself also a barrier, right? You have to get it has to be a state ID, or it has to be a driver's license, which is really a permit to do something, not really an ID. And I mean, of course we use it as such, but so I guess maybe the question I'll phrase is sticking kind of around the barriers is what are the barriers? Like, why is that happening? Is it just because the US is a federated structure and people are doing things so differently all over the place? It's like, why are we seeing so many different like national approaches elsewhere around the world? And I mean, it just seems like in the US we have no kind of plan, and we're seeing it maybe from the bottom up when it really should be top down. And again, I guess I'll let the group how about that?
I'll be a little controversial to start off with, and then I'll stop talking. The reality here in the U.S. is that we are of many opinions, and as such, there's too much debate to actually come together and create a solution on one particular issue, right? And on that note, of our many opinions, right, we have I would say the heavy lean towards privacy in some instances. We have the heavy lean towards tech adoption. In other instances, we have the reality and promise of what should be done by the government. We have what should be done by commercial sector, and a lot of debates going on and all that, which basically makes it very difficult in our current form of democracy to actually move forward in making substantial progress. It's not to say that it is impossible, but it's to say that it is a barrier that we have to acknowledge for that. And then that just dovetails into where we see all these things break down downstream when you're thinking of how do you build a solution that actually starts to work for everyone.
I think part of it's also been an issue of political will. This has not really been a top tier issue in a long time. So I know there's a question in here about NSTIC, the old National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. I led that program for the Obama administration for a few years. That was issued back in 2011. And we're now through 2 administrations since the Obama administration, both Trump and Biden, where there has not been any national strategy on how to approach this. Although Jordan actually did some great work when he was at OMB over the last few years, and at least advancing some policies on parts of it. But treating this as critical infrastructure, treating identity as an overarching priority that we're actually going to work on creating solutions. It's been a long time since we've actually had a strategy. And I think we sometimes run into issues where, because identity touches so many different issues, it kind of gets caught in the middle ground between them. It's really important to security. I mean, we're seeing hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud between government benefits and the private sector each year because of compromises of identity. It's really important to privacy, and that if you build these things wrong, it's a privacy nightmare. But it's also important if you look at new laws like in California, where you can go ask a company to share all their data with you. Well, if they don't have an easy way to figure out who you are, you're actually opening up an attack vector for the bad guys to pose as you and get your data, which is a problem we're starting to see in some places. And it's also really important when it comes to the title of this, how can digital ID transform government services? But because it doesn't fit neatly into any one of those buckets, because it impacts a lot of different sectors, it kind of falls between the cracks. And so, from our perspective, this really needs to be declared a national priority and treated as such if we're going to make progress. There's some interesting things happening in the States right now. If you are piloting mobile driver's licenses, the vital records bureaus are starting to think about digital counterparts to paper birth certificates, but it's not being coordinated at a single level. And I worry that we're going to end up with a lot of kind of interesting but partial solutions that don't actually really meet the definition of being the infrastructure that we need.
Yeah, I think that what Jordan and Jeremy have pointed out is just like the foundational question of whose job is it to solve this question? Whose priority will it be? And I know we're going to talk more about kind of what identity solutions can look like later in the conversation, but I think a central question that I bring from like the work that the Digital Benefits Network has been doing around identity proofing and authentication for public benefits, a type of government service that we really want to make sure are accessible to the people who are eligible for them, are we going to design solutions, if we decide to make this a priority, are we going to design solutions that are as usable by as many people as possible, and create options so that we're like having multiple pathways to make it possible for people to access these services if the mainstream solutions aren't going to work for them.
So maybe just like a few observations on some of the things that other panelists have said and the questions you've asked, Eric. So the first is, so you asked him like, why not? Why hasn't America acted? And I think actually there actually are, as people pointed out, like various actions taking place in like different places, which I actually think are like in some ways good. Like, so it's like that's like part of the strength of America. It's also part of the weakness, which is like you get people who are doing kind of like laboratory experiments. Actually, one of the sad things is like you could create digital driver's licenses and that would be nice to have on your phone, but she doesn't create any of like the power of a digital ID in the way that many other countries are imagining it. Like it doesn't actually enable you to, like being able to show my driver's license on my phone does not actually create a digital ID that allows me to transact in a digital way. It simply replicates a paper form on my phone. And so it misses out all the benefits, but it has enough of the kind of like pizzazz and internet that it seems engaging. So this is like the kind of the terrible choices that I fear are going to be made. And a few things. One is there is definitely a lack of urgency. And I say this like in a kind of frustrated way, in that like if you're in India or if you're in Brazil, particularly if you're like in India, there's like hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who don't have any foundational ID. And so therefore are literally excluded from access to markets, access to some services. And so there's like, that creates a huge amount of urgency. Whereas in the United States, the number of people who are excluded are much smaller and are like almost exclusively at the margins, and therefore don't get the type of political attention that I think probably we all agree that they deserve to get. But because it's a small group and they're at the margin, they become easier to ignore. And so people treat identity as a solved problem in the United States, even though there's actually this like critical group of people who would benefit, who kind of actually get ignored. The second is there's this kind of weird notion in the United States that like government involvement in the space is deeply problematic, and that the private sector, like the most efficient and effective way is the private sector to solve this. This is why I think the infrastructure lens is so important, because infrastructure does not mean that the private sector can't play a role, but the infrastructure lens really, it focuses on both inclusion and access and on a regulatory regime that champions interoperability. So like we have a grid in the United States, and the grid may even have private players who are help building it. It's not like when you get power provision to your home, it's like you choose which grid you're going to choose. Like, no, there's a single grid, and that interoperability makes access and inclusion easier. And we layer all sorts of rules to ensure that like they can't just come turn off the energy to your home or use that grid to extract really expensive rent for you to get in. So that's why like the infrastructure lens creates with it all sorts of things. And that, I think the big conversation, the way the conversation in the United States has to shift is away from thinking of identity as the place where you want competition for delivery to an infrastructure which enables all sorts of new competition takes on top of it. And when that shift happens, and I think things will move very quickly in the United States, because once they understand where the competition is, then like everybody knows how to like support a market in this country and so wants to drive it. But I also at the same time think we can't ignore like the federated piece. And I just don't think the United States will ever have a centrally provisioned or centrally coordinated ID. I think this is a mistake to try to pursue that. It's really about how to create those interoperable standards that are going to allow the various kind of federated players. Otherwise, you're kind of like, as the only non-American in the room, I kind of like some caution here, but I don't think that you can run into that kind of deep sense of both American identity and the Constitution and be successful. So we have to, as much as you might want to look and wish it away or look to it like an Estonian trying to model after them, you have to take that into reality. And the final thing that I got just want to observe is what I really worry about, and I think that both Jeremy and Elizabeth in particular are worried about, is we could solve the authentication problem at the federal or at the state level without actually addressing the digital identity problem. So you could use login.gov or you could use a service to allow people to log in, but it doesn't solve all those people I talked about who don't have IDs. So you can make the process better, again, for the vast majority of Americans. They have a wonderful service. It'd be like single sign, everything that they do. That's an authentication solution. The real quick, we can't lose sight of like this infrastructure's need around identity so that those who are most at risk can then get into LogGov and get into those services in the first place, which is what I think Elizabeth's really hammering on. That's so important, can't be lost in this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, you hit on a few things there. I mean, for instance, you're saying obviously there was an instance where the Government Accountability Office shared that there was a huge amount of fraud and identity theft surrounding unemployment insurance over the pandemic. So to some degree, it's like we're looking for opportunities to, avoid that from an authentication point of view. But to your point, there would still be a lot of people who have no identity to even apply for the services in the first place, right? And you also talked about login.gov, which was, again, in the news recently. And, maybe this hits on a bit of what, Elizabeth, you were going in terms of, what do solutions look like that are out there? I think many of us were probably to some degree kind of pro login.gov and wondering like, oh yeah, look, this is, kind of a shared solution across, federal services. But it turns out it really wasn't as robust as we thought, so I guess maybe Jordan and Jeremy, this might be a good question for y'all. How do federal agencies kind of evaluate that? I mean, one of it is GSA being honest about the product and vendors being honest about what their solutions. But like what should federal agencies kind of look for? How do they evaluate identity and authentication solutions? And what kind of things should they expect from if it's a solution from a third party or so?
Well, I think at a high level, I mean, just to dive a little deeper into the login issues. So, I think as David pointed out, it's, I said before, there's identity proofing and there's authentication. Login.gov for years has been focused on authentication and what I would call customer account management. I come in, I'm Jeremy Grant at Gmail. Great. Here's a password and an MFA, layer on top of it, and you can use it to sign in at a bunch of different services. As I've said for a while, authentication is getting easier. They've kind of done that part. Identity proofing is a really different game. And this is where they've been struggling. And as you were talking about, there was a recent Inspector General report that basically pointed out they were telling agencies they met a certain level of assurance as called out by NIST. And in fact, they weren't and had gone in a different direction. And we could probably have a whole other webinar just on that. But I think it gets to really two key points. One, as I've said, identity proofing is hard. And they're, while GSA was able to code a solution to do authentication, building something custom, you can't go code identity proofing. Solving identity proofing really gets into how do I get, access to the authoritative sources in government, or be able to work with companies like where Jordan's at, it's Secure, who've got alternative solutions that, I sometimes talk somewhat disparagingly about the identity verification industry to trying to guess what only the government really knows, but a lot of them actually work pretty well. And I think a lot of where Login's focus right now is on, focusing on what solutions can they buy to help with ID proofing as opposed to building anything. There's a bigger issue when it comes to login and government services in general, which I think is there's a vision that is lacking, which is I already went to the DMV a few years ago and it was a crappy process, but I waited in line, I showed up, I proved who I was, and I got a plastic ID card out of it that even had a little star for the Real ID Act showing it was compliant with federal standards. I've done the same thing at the post office for a passport. I had to renew mine a couple of years ago. Also not an awesome user experience. Why is it that we're architecting a system to manage access to U.S. government services at the federal level, and some are aspiring to push this out to the state level, that is trying to force Americans to duplicate the crappy experience they went through at the DMV? To me, it's from a customer experience perspective, where I know the Biden administration has focused a lot on customer experience, including putting out an executive order. It's about the worst experience you could give people. And I'd much rather see, all of the money that we're investing in things like login right now. Let's take some of that and push it back out to the states who are in the best position in many cases with things like driver's licenses and state ID cards to upgrade their systems so that it's not just physical identity infrastructure, but also digital identity infrastructure. My user experience, if I'm trying to sign up for an account at the SSA or to do something at the IRS or to apply for, something with federal student aid, hey, do you have something on your phone or, in secure hardware on your laptop that you can use that's a digital credential that in about 10 seconds you can use to prove who you are, rather than go through a 10 to 15 minute process of uploading information and taking pictures of your driver's license and answering questions tied to your credit report. That's, I think, where the real focus should be right now. And I think Login will probably be able to, at least in terms of leveraging industry solutions, make some progress in addressing the identity proofing problem but it's going to be very narrow for government benefits. And I feel like they'd be in a much better place if they just looked at the agencies that are already in the identity business and look to help bolster their capabilities rather than try to sort of create their own Rube Goldberg machine that, sort of gets you to the same place. That's the big matter.
To Jeremy's point on, proofing is hard, right? And as a company that specializes in would be identity proofing and fraud prevention, I actually go back to my time in government. It was like 2018, 2019 timeframe. We were working on the president's budget at that point in time. We actually wrote into the president's budget that we needed to find ways of modernizing identity proofing. Why? Credit ecosystem has failed. Data is way too accessible to everyone. There's way too many breaches that happen, and as a result, KBA and everything else was becoming defunct. There was ways in which people were being left out of the system, and we had to get ahead of what was going to be potentially fraud. Fast forward to pandemic, a lot of what we had recommended was actually just never done. And so, when I left government, it was under the premise of trying to unpack why we made, I would say, we made progress, but it was not in the leaps and bounds that we were seeking to make. The reality is that being able to measure and identify what good looks like, what success looks like, is something that has just long been lacking as it comes to proofing in particular. So one of the things we talk about now over at Socare is the ability to measure outcomes associated with a verification or a proofing transaction, so that you actually know who is being impacted, who is able to get through the process in a seamless manner. How many people are you having inadvertently be redirected and told that they're not who they are ultimately? How many people are you subjecting to what would be long manual review queues in particular, and how costly is that, right? Like, I still hear stories of long call center waits or these queues that exist for processing what the benefits or other services. It doesn't have to be that way. And then, through that, you're able to take an iterative approach where you can identify some of the root cause as to why these people aren't able to get through an online process. When we talk about identity proofing verification in particular, I far too often hear people say that, like, being able to get 70 to 80% of the people at a best day is like good. It's not. Actually, that's horrible, because you're just sticking with really what is the Pareto principle of 80-20, and you're just thinking the 20 is like good enough. That should not be the case. It should be higher than 90. It should be 95 plus. And there's ways in which you can do that, but it starts with measurement in particular. And so for anyone who says that you can't get that high, and that for me, I'm obsessed on making sure that the online channel, for all those who can access it, it is accessible to them, right? There's definitely use cases where folks will not have access to online channels. They have to find a way to verify in person. They have to find ways in which they augment what is a digital realm. But for those who can engage with computers, those who have smartphones, those who are connected in some way, shape, or form, there's no reason why they should be able to prove who they are online. And in this day and age, again, we've just lagged far too behind. And a lot of it stems to that lack of measurement and that lack of transparency. Everyone should be transparent. Vendors should be transparent. The government should be transparent. What does approval look like? What does false positives look like? What does fraud capture look like? What does manual review look like? Because by then you're able to determine ROI, you're able to determine success, you're able to determine impacts to demographics. Like, these are all things that we should be able to measure. And so I think the way in which we start to work our way out of this problem is by, transparency through measurement ultimately.
If I could just quickly say, I think one area where, Jeremy, I don't know if we're in disagreement, but I do think login.gov has the potential of trying to set standards for how one might try to do KYC. And that then it could pull on the private sector and say, if you send us data, if we could start standardizing the way that we're getting information in and try to create standards that then the states might replicate, the private sector might replicate, you could create a much more interoperable system. And you could use that as a lever to go about doing that. It doesn't mean that they have to do the KYC themselves. Maybe they are also doing setup themselves, but it could engage some of those players. That's the kind of thinking that I think in the United States is going to be needed to move this forward. And not to just do it in a kind of theoretical standards making way, but actually drive it with a particular use case.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree on the need for standards. I don't know that the GSA, the General Services Administration, is the place to do it. I think work should be led by NIST here. In fact, we actually worked within the Better Identity Coalition with Congress last year to get language into the NISTRI authorization that was included in the CHIPS and Science Act that directs NIST to expand the work they do in digital ID to also focus on guidance to states and federal agencies and local agencies on how to do identity and attribute validation services, which is something that a lot of them don't know how to do. And then, I think the other thing that we think is going to be needed is, how do you actually, get a whole of government approach, recognizing our authoritative issuers are split between federal, state, and local. GSA, I think, needs to be at the table there, given the role they're playing with login and other citizen services. But, we ultimately think this is something that the White House should be convening to try and bring everybody together, along with, key folks from the security community, from the advocacy community, to sort of figure out, this whole concept of operations for how are we going to get to digital identity infrastructure.
To follow up on this, I think something that like our team in thinking about login or other kind of the promise of shared services at the federal level around authentication and proofing, I think the piece that feels most exciting or potentially game changing for government service access is the idea of not having to duplicate an authentication or proofing process. And we're not at that stage now, but I do think that's sort of something to keep in mind is like what we might strive for in this area. And also kind of picking up on things that Jordan was speaking to. I think, Jordan, the importance of metrics, actually understanding how these tools are working for people, where they're failing, is something that's really missing right now, and would love to see more of that. And I know Secure has been really leading the way and from the private sector space around those conversations. And I also think that, Jordan, your comments get into this question about like, what does design look like of an identity tool or a process, rather approach to identity proofing look like that's going to serve all or almost every user. And I think it means not just improving the specific solutions that governments or agencies are directing users towards, but also probably means offering multiple pathways for demonstrating who you are and making those options meaningfully equivalent in terms of ease and access. And I think that it matters not just for usability, like, does this tool work for me or people like me, but in terms of acceptability, like, do I feel comfortable or safe using this tool? Is this a technology, for example, face recognition, that like I want to be using? And I think that that's a part of this conversation we could keep having.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Elizabeth. I was going to look to you too for this kind of these questions around accessibility of a solution and also what may be required to go into that in terms of kind of universal and inclusive design before a solution is out. And kind of hitting on what Jordan was saying, how do you get a solution to hit those 95% plus kind of working for everyone? Is there, and Jordan, maybe Secure does this, like what kind of things, is it testing? Is it like what needs to go on behind the scenes so that when a solution is out there and it's active and people are, and Elizabeth, I know you've thought about this too, where people are accessing government services and it's working for everyone, as many people as it can, and at the same time maybe there are ways so people don't slip through the cracks. So if were you thinking about IRS and like ID, facial recognition, it's like, okay, it works for 80% of the people, but as if it doesn't work for some people, what else can they do? Or it's how do we really get those solutions to be as robust as possible?
Yeah, I mean, so, speaking from Secure's standpoint, I would say there's a couple of things, right? I'm going to try to make it not so much all about us, but how about we raise the bar for everyone in particular? If you actually look to financial services industry in particular, one of the things that they do employ is actually they will performance test a number of their providers of various types of solutions, right? In government, we have this tendency to go with a compliance culture versus one of performance at the end of the day, which leads us to missing the boat when it comes to understanding impact associated with these items. There is ways in which you can actually measure and perform what we call data studies or these tests where you're able to see impacts across users from a historical lens. So you're able to identify how many people potentially were left out of the process, who should have been added to the process, or those who were inappropriately approved, who should have been outright rejected. From there, you can then further stratify and identify where the demographic impacts were. And we actually use that as part of our methodology for developing what is our machine learning products or models that we use for fraud prevention to help determine are there areas where folks are negatively being impacted that we should, solve for? For an example, something I've talked about in other forums is around just something as simple as an address, right? And how you search against an address and how you identify and normalize an address for a given population or context. It may be shocking to everyone that when we all input our addresses and we set up databases across the country, we all don't design them in the same way, which means if you're trying to do a one-to-one match, you actually have to use some type of search algorithm in order to do that. There's certain biases that are introduced in those algorithms in particular. And then if you're not taking into perspective context associated with that address, for an example, Puerto Rico, for a given zip code or a given location, you may have, a house with the same number and the same name exactly. And there's have to be further ways to differentiate. If you're not able to sift through that or design things in a way that you're able to solve for that fringe use case at the same time you're solving for everything else, then you're of course going to have what are impacts across different types of groups, different use cases you're ultimately trying to solve for. Additionally, one thing that we try to solve for and we try to look for is looking at everything at the same time. And I'm going to say looking holistically. We also have a problem with our industry where we take multiple things and we just try to daisy chain them in order to, if you do this, you do this, you do this, then you can pass go collect $200, right? That doesn't work in all cases, because maybe I'm going through some type of change in my life, right? One of the things my wife and I were debating before we got married is whether or not she was going to change her name. If she was actually to go through the name change process, getting through that, and then at the same time you're trying to do things like buy a house, buy a car, it actually can be very problematic because things are not going to match, because part of your identity and name is not something that is static anymore, right? Or has ever been really. It is changing, and that actually causes you to fail. So it's only by taking, again, this process where you're really looking through, you're looking through your data, you're looking for ways you can solve for different types of use cases, you're taking those results, using that to inform your strategies to improve it. That's how you start to get out of what we're currently seeing, and you actually get to the point of being able to measure and push towards 95%. And as a company that strives on accuracy, that is the one thing that we're aiming for. It is achievable. 95 plus is achievable. And then, that's where, I would like to see the conversation move just broadly as we talk about proofing in this space, is how do you push everyone to being more accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a good point in terms of, so I just said for a minute, look, I don't think login should be leading this. I feel like we should be focusing not on, identity solutions just for government services, but for every type of service that's repeatable. Just because I have that opinion, I don't think login is going to change what they're doing anytime soon. And they'll probably be leaning on vendor solutions, from companies like Socure. To Jordan's point, I think what would be great to see there is, because different products perform differently for different types of people, don't just try to do something like put out requirements and buy lowest cost, technically acceptable solutions, which is often how the government procures things. Let's do a performance-based acquisition. Let's identify, a half dozen of the most promising solutions and line them up and test them and see how they all work, fund a bunch of pilots. And then the ones that actually can, identify people accurately and reliably, at least at the highest numbers, that's the solution you go forward with. I think the other thing I wanted to just, to riff on what Jordan said, whether we talk about the use of face biometrics or the use of document authentication solutions or knowledge-based verification, everybody always wants to seize on one technology and say it's the solution or it's terrible. And the reality is it's a lot more gray. So, knowledge-based verification, like the attackers have largely caught up with it, but it can still be helpful for what I would call identity resolution, figuring out which of the 300 Jeremy Grants is applying. Biometrics aren't perfect, though their accuracy is getting a heck of a lot better, to the point that the top algorithms are actually downright frightening, but they're still not going to work for everybody. That doesn't mean that, I always point out, if I'm a 19-year-old person of color with no credit history, but I have a driver's license and a smartphone, well, I will probably fail something based on credit data, but might be able to get through a system that's based on, taking a document picture and taking a selfie. So, realizing that you might have different paths for different types of people based on what they have in terms of devices, in terms of identity in hand already, create a few different pathways that can get everybody through.
I think that's such an excellent point, Jeremy. Like, if we think about multiple welcoming doors for public benefits delivery in general, for like accessing an application, if there is an identity proofing prompt or requirement in place, how can we think about multiple ways to get through that process? And kind of bouncing off what Jordan and Jeremy have been speaking to, our team at the Digital Benefits Network has been doing some landscape research to actually understand what does identity proofing and authentication look like across public benefits programs in the United States and territories. And I can share more about that. Some of that data is already public. It will all be public later in May. We started by publishing data for unemployment insurance applications. And a lot of what we learned, both through that process and also speaking with advocates who were helping clients who were trying to get through some of these identity proofing processes and facing obstacles, and also by speaking with state agency leaders around some of the sort of conflicting potential challenges or priorities they faced in terms of balancing fraud prevention against promoting access to these programs, really made us think about the fact that there's not always clear information available to state agencies on guidance and a support for evaluating some of these approaches to identity proofing. And I think some of the things that we've been thinking about on our team coming out of that research are some foundational questions around identity proofing or digital identity in public benefits, starting with a foundational question of like, for a particular application or transaction, is it necessary to do identity proofing? If there are other touch points down the line, like an interview or an appointment, do you actually need to know who someone is at that first moment of an application? And if you do want to incorporate identity proofing into your process, online identity proofing into your process at some point, does it have to happen during the application? Can it be something that happens later? And echoing kind of what Jeremy was speaking to, this point around optionality. So multiple paths in as being super important. And I think that we kind of really want to recognize that like this is a challenging thing, like we've been talking about this whole session. Identity proofing is hard, but I think trying to outline some of the key questions that we might ask, and also thinking about ways the federal agencies are already doing some of this work. For example, the Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization. But how can we support individual agencies while we continue to have this kind of federated approach to identity in thinking through when and how is identity proofing needed and what might it look like?
So I think the thing that I'm observing in this conversation is there are a lot of kind of like competing policy objectives that one might have or one might choose when thinking about this. Like, you know, are we trying to maximize inclusion and access? Are we trying to reduce fraud? Also, like who gets counted and when do they get counted and how do they get counted? There's a whole bunch of different questions here. And I think one thing that I really want to impress on the listeners, and one reason, again, why I think infrastructure approach is so important, is it is, in my mind, inevitable that Americans are going to have a digital ID in the 21st century. So it's like, you are not going to be able to operate in a world where, like, even if you only do physical things, at some point you will have to make a digital payment, or someone will ask to authenticate you, and they'll only have a digital system to do that. So you'll have to like either not get that service from a private company because you can't. This is inevitable. So then the only question then becomes is, what is the governance of that digital ID? So are we going to step back and say this is going to be entirely provisioned and regulated and governed more or less self-regulated by the private sector? Or is there going to be some government, it could be provision digital identity, or it could be kind of schema governance system that oversees what the private sector is doing and determines like what are the rules that everybody has to play by? That for me is the real question that's in front of us. And I think there's a real risk right now that people are kind of avoiding that conversation. It's like, oh, the private sector is going to do it. I'm like, yes, but then you're actually like the important questions that Jeremy and Elizabeth are all raising are now going to be dealt by private players making decisions about what best serves their system and makes things profitable and easy for them, and not by what maximizes inclusion and access and trust and safety. And that is for me is the core question that we have to get to. And there I agree, like I will pause, I don't want to overspeak too much.
Thank you for that, David. Yeah, we do need to switch to some of these audience questions. I know we only have a few minutes left, so hopefully you can fire off a couple of answers. Maybe one I'll start with is, we've touched a little bit about kind of privacy and security. So one question we had from the audience was, can you discuss the fear of using biometrics for identity proofing? We've been doing it for years, fingerprints, if you think about like a smartphone. Why am I proving my identity with paper?
I think it's maybe important to think about the different kinds of biometrics that face, and people have different levels of comfort or thoughts on this. This is a pretty challenging topic, I think. But I think face prints, face recognition is quite different from fingerprint as biometric verification, just in terms of how we move through the world. And the fact that our faces are often much more visible in public spaces than our fingerprints. And I think face recognition, we often can get into conversations about, are we talking about sort of surveillance versus face recognition for verification purposes? But this is a really challenging topic. I think it raises some hard questions about privacy, but also about data security. What happens to biometric data? Who holds it if it's being used for a verification process? And is there a meaningful opportunity to say, no, thank you? And I think that's a really, really tough question.
Yeah, just to jump in, I would agree with Elizabeth. I think face is a little bit different. It's certainly been highly controversial lately, but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it as well. So I've long been very skeptical about the idea of creating new, databases of biometrics, because I think when you have these big central data stores, I mean, one thing we've seen for years is we don't actually know how to secure anything that's valuable. We continue to see stuff get, breached and leaked out. And so when people tell me that a solution is, oh, you're going to submit your fingerprints and your iris and whatnot, that's not going to end well. Face is a little different in that our photos are generally everywhere. More to the point, when I apply for a driver's license, when I apply for a passport, they already have my face. And, getting to the point I made before of how do we build digital identity systems that don't create new databases, but instead leverage what we already have? Well, we're not going to undo the fact that the DMV is, using my face already because it's a photo ID that they're issuing. Same with, the State Department for passports. So why can't we look for ways to leverage that? Now, I do think with the issues of bias and, a lot of the concern that we've seen around face, to Elizabeth's point, there's a lot of different ways that face is being used. When I use face to unlock my iPhone, that's matched only on this device. When I'm dealing with a company, say like Clearview, who's selling surveillance technology, and you see people who are mistakenly arrested because they were walking down the street and they caught a side glimpse of them under weird lighting, like you're seeing me get right now from a high window that needs a shade. Like that's awful. That stuff needs to be blasted into the sun. In the middle is something like DMVs for 20 years have been doing what I would call biometric deduplication to make sure that I don't show up 1 week as Jeremy Grant and get a driver's license, and then a month later shave my head and grow a mustache and come in as Jim Bob Grant and get a second ID. And that's worked relatively well. Likewise, the selfie match tools that, the IRS, suddenly found itself in hot water about a year ago. Look, there's a lot of different products that are out there. I was talking before about login should line up the best ones and test them. But, the best ones work relatively well. It's why these companies actually exist and are selling a lot to banks and others, is it does provide a new way to do onboarding. And so I think there's just one more education needed about the different types of face and where there's bias and also where things can go wrong if there is. And then also I think the science just, ultimately I think the science will show that there are ways you can use that technology in a way that's reliable and safe and equitable. But more work's going to need to be done between government and industry to really sort of provide those data points that might help us get past where we're at in this conversation right now.
Yeah, I think this, just to quickly add 2 points. One, it should be governed by choice optionality, basically. Right. So those who want to use it can use it. Those who don't want to use it don't. Just like Jeremy mentioned the iPhone, but like when it first rolled out, and it was 2017 with iPhone X, there was a lot of backlash around using it. And then eventually people realized how easy it was and they hated remembering their passcodes. And then they started to opt into it. Like, you have to let people make their own decisions and get through there. So choices becomes important. Finding ways to be progressive in your proofing as you're using face or these other types of tools is important, because then you are able to make decisions about, how much friction you put in front of people. The second thing is, going back to what I said earlier on transparency and measurement and things along those lines, you start to work past some of these challenges and these issues when people are transparent about their usage of these tools, how they're like, what is being done with them, the use case specifically associated with it, what performance looks like related to it, and then like, what are you doing to address performance gaps? If you're not doing any of that, then it stands to reason people are not going to want to use face or any other technology for that matter.
I want to try to squeeze in one last question, if I can. Sorry, David.
I just want to piggyback on Jordan.
10 seconds.
Two important things here. One is, I do think choices and the choice matters, because it's actually there's an inversion of an inclusion and access issue here, which is all sorts of wealthy people or people who fly a lot get to go decide for reasons of convenience they want to use biometrics. But the kind of an anti-biometrics view of not even giving an option is somehow like we're going to deprive people who are at the margin having that same convenience if they want to get like their food stamp benefits or things like that. So we need to provide this choice. And the other thing, I just from an international context, is the United States is in a very unique position. There are countries in the world where there's hundreds of millions of people who don't read or write. And so the only way that you're going to get them an identity is if you use biometrics. While we may, so let's also be careful about how we judge how other countries are making choices, because they may have fewer policy options in front of them on how to enable inclusion and access in their country.
Cool. Maybe one, I know we're pretty much already at time, but I think one kind of interesting question from the audience, and it's potentially helpful in terms of thinking about what's the future look like for this and kind of digital IDs, was should government even have a role in ID anymore with decentralization, blockchain removing a need for central authority to establish trust? So it's kind of an interesting question in terms of something that's been emerging around blockchain and what role it could potentially play in solutions like these.
I think anybody who says that blockchain means that you don't need an authoritative source to say who you are is kind of missing the point about how identity works. I could say I'm Taylor Swift and put it on the blockchain, and that'll work really well for anything where identity doesn't matter. If I want to do something with the bank, if I want to do something with the government, that's not going to get too far. And I think, thankfully, most of the folks who were the blockchain enthusiasts sort of pushing this approach a few years ago have realized that this actually won't work. And they're starting to shift toward things like the new verifiable credential standard that's come out of the W3C, which explicitly anticipates that you'll have authoritative sources like government cryptographically assigning assertions as to the validity of a certain attribute about you on chain. So I think that's where things are going. But if you want to proclaim you're Taylor Swift or Santa Claus or whatever on chain, I would say good luck using that solution. I'm sure it'll get you far.
Well, we are already over time. I know there are some questions we didn't get to. I'm certainly going to take note of these, and maybe work with you all kind of offline to get some feedback. But I just want to thank the panel again. As I expected, ran out of that time, our hour, very quickly, but I think we covered a lot of stuff. So I appreciate David, Jordan, Elizabeth, Jeremy. Thanks again for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to the audience, hopefully that was insightful in some regard. But we appreciate everyone who joined and participated. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.